Hello everyone, it's Robert here. So today's video is going to be one that is quite a big one. It could be quite controversial, and the title does seem a little bit clickbaity, but I would like to say by the end of the video I hope that everything's explained, because it does sound a little bit sensationalist. This video is not to attack Dr. Jordan Peterson in any regard. This is to actually understand what he's going through and what he believes to be true and his own conscious experience. And it is technically a request to interview him because he's the only one who has these answers. And basically I would like to talk to him about some very in-depth things that go on within our own conscious experience. And he talks about a lot how it's hard to conceptualize these ideas and no one's actually done it yet. And we're basically going to try and do that, and also my own interpretation of what schizophrenia seems to be. Now, before I begin, I would like to point out I'm not diagnosed with schizophrenia. I may have accidentally induced it through meditation in the wrong way, but all the professionals I've spoken to, because it doesn't offer or have any negative cognitive effects on my being, they've just kind of said carry on and show up if there's any problems. And I've spent a long time working on this idea because it's an obsession at this point. I want to know what the answer is, and I don't think I can actually find the answer anymore within my own being unless I go and talk to people for more data or ideas to discuss. So this video here is going to be doing that, and then bringing Dr. Jordan Peterson's experiences into it using videos of speeches that he's done in the past and a few other things, especially how he talks about Carl Jung. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about, how an individual creates ideas or has thoughts. And the first video I'm going to link in regards to this is Dr. Jordan Peterson talking about Carl Jung's his memory or his ability to memorize ideas or vividly reproduce things that he's seen and interact with them within his own being, or what I would just call the imagination. And then we're going to go from there. So this is the first video.
One question might be, well, because I read Jung and I think, how the hell did he know these things? How could he figure these things out? I can't understand how he could possibly know these things. Well, here's a partial answer. Jung was a visionary, and so what that means, as far as I can tell, and we could do a little quick survey here. How many of you think in words? Put up your hands. Do you think in words? Okay, so it looks like. What about pictures? How many of you think in pictures? Okay, so that's interesting. How many of you think, that's about half and half, by the way, probably a fewer on the word side. How many of you think in pictures and words? Okay, and so, all right, so it was roughly a third in each category, but that's also something that I really haven't encountered any research on from the neuropsychological perspective. It's well, do you think in pictures or do you think in words? And is that actually a reliable distinction? I think in words most of the time, but I can think in pictures. Like if I'm trying to build something, I can think in pictures almost instantaneously, but it isn't my natural mode of thinking. I'm hyperverbal, and so my natural mode of thinking is to think everything through in words. But I know my wife isn't like that. She thinks in images and then has to translate them into words. And so, anyways, Jung was very literate and he could really think in words, but he could really think in images. Also, talking to my wife quite extensively, the intensity of her visualization vastly exceeds mine. So for example, if I close my eyes and I try to imagine the crowd in front of me, it's pretty low resolution and vague and not brilliantly colored and vivid. It's like I'm seeing through a glass darkly, let's say. I can't bring images to mind with spectacular clarity, but my wife is very good at that, and Jung seemed to be absolutely a genius at that kind of thinking.
So the key thing for me in this video is how Jordan Peterson talks about the difference between having thoughts in words and thoughts in images or abstract ideas, I guess. That's how I would personally word it myself. He talks about these like they're the exact same thing, and I would like to point out that I don't think that they're the same thing. I think they're fundamentally different, but there's a coherence between them. So I think words come from the ego and like the persona to an extent, and they're basically how you communicate what you're feeling, right? And that's how you have an internal monologue. Then on the other side of things, it seems like there's the imagination or your being or your conscious or your intuition, and that's like the mind's eye or what people refer to it as. And you can create ideas that you believe are true, and then you have to vocalize them into actual words and meaning, and then once you do that, you process those ideas, right? So that's how I interpret this thing, because they're completely different things in my opinion. Because I would also question that the imagination is also like the mind's eye is also how you view your own memories, right? So it sounds like he's also talking about memories in terms of being able to visualize what you've experienced, and how vivid it is like a skill apparently, or in his eyes a genius like quality. I'm pretty sure this is something that you can just work on. You have to sit there and obviously work on your imagination, and then understand the differences between what you believe is real versus what is actually real. And not a lot of people actually do that in my experiences. So I just wanted to put that out there to begin with, because I do think, and this is quite important, that imagination is different to our ability to think, right? Because he talks about imagination and thinking as like they're the same thing, and I don't believe that they are. And I know from my own personal experience that I can differentiate the two of them quite well, and there's little rules that go in between these two, because I would class these two as like the veil between what we, the abstract, as he words it, and the real world, which we'll go into more detail in a moment. Now, one of the most important videos in my opinion where Jordan Peterson talks about this it's titled Spiritual Awakening, and I'm going to start at a certain point within the video, so the context is somewhat missing. But before this, he's basically talking about how he was at a prison, and there was like a prison psychologist who just wasn't intimidated by very brutal prisoners, I guess, like murderers and whatnot, as we'll find out in the video. And then I think he questions his own identity in relation to this person, and then it seems to cause, as he calls it, it's a split in his psyche. Now, this is something that I'm pretty much going to focus on going forward, right? Because this I feel is like an insane idea. I think it's very important to note why this happens, and this is one of the reasons I think he could have schizophrenia, or like if you were going to label him having a mental disorder, I think schizophrenia would be a good one, but I don't think schizophrenia is that big of a deal, as I'm about to go into. But here's the video. There's a lot to take away from this, but the more important factors are, like, it sounds like he's hearing voices, even though it sounds like he doesn't. It sounds like the voice is omnipotent to him, or an eternal voice that is communicating with him. And all the logical reasonings that he explains for how he worked through this is something that I've actually gone through myself in my own experiences. Mine are a little bit more darker, and that's a conversation for another time. But I think this video just emphasizes a lot of what I'm about to go into and why this happens. So here's the video, and let's talk in a second.
Anyways, about the same time, and I don't exactly know how these things were causally related. I guess it was because I was trying to figure out who I was and how that could be fixed, something like that. I started to pay very careful attention to what I was saying. I don't know if that happened voluntarily or involuntarily, but I could feel a sort of split developing in my psyche, and the split, and I've actually had students tell me the same thing that has happened to them after they've listened to some of the material that I've been describing to all of you. But I split into two, let's say. And one part was let's say the old me that was talking a lot, and that liked to argue, and that liked ideas. And there was another part that was watching that part, like just with its eyes open and neutrally judging. And the part that was neutrally judging was watching the part that was talking and going, that isn't your idea. You don't really believe that. You don't really know what you're talking about. That isn't true. And I thought, that's really interesting. So now and that was happening to like 95% of what I was saying. And so then I didn't really know what to do. I thought, okay, this is strange. So maybe I've fragmented, and that's just not a good thing at all. I mean, it wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything like that. I mean, it wasn't like that. It was, well, people have multiple parts. So then I had this weird conundrum. It was like, well, which of these two things are me? Is it the part that's listening and saying, no, that's rubbish, that's a lie, you're doing that to impress people, you're just trying to win the argument, you know? Was that me, or was the part that was going about my normal verbal business me? And I didn't know, but I decided I would go with the critic. And then what I tried to do, what I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. And now I mean, I'm still trying to do that, because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. And I think the alignment, I really do think the alignment I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. And I learned some of that from reading Carl Rogers, by the way, who's a great clinician, because he talked about mental health in part as a coherence between the spiritual or the abstract and the physical, that the two things were aligned. And there's a lot of idea of alignment in psychoanalytic and clinical thinking. But anyways, I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and I mean, this was over a few months, but it's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that you're mostly dead wood. It's a shock. You know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen.
All right, so that's a wild video, and there's a lot to talk about. As I said, it does sound like he's saying like I wasn't hearing voices, but it kind of sounds like he was hearing voices. I would like to kind of know if there was any like eternal or omnipotent feelings coming from this voice or this watcher or the critic. I think a good word to name it is a critic, and I would be just genuinely curious to know what he felt during those moments and what he thought it was, because he doesn't really dive into that. And I think this is really important, right? Because I do think that there's like there's two entities within a human being, and there's a hierarchy to them instead of a fighting for competition. And I think the hierarchy is like you have on top your ego and your thought processes, and then below that is the unconscious and your intuition, which is basically like your cognitive bias or the filter that you see the world in, right? Because everyone kind of has a meaning or a definition of what they think life is. And obviously if you don't have that, then it's very hard to find your internal compass or your intuition or your internal monologue or any of those things, because it's a void, right? If you don't believe in anything, it's a void. Now, when it comes to Jordan Peterson, because I don't know if he believes in magical powers of God or Jesus Christ. We will get into that a little bit later. However, his ability to conceptualize ideas, because he's so well read, and it's Jordan Peterson, he's probably like the smartest person alive in my opinion. He's very wise. Without getting into his politics, as a clinical psychologist, he's fantastic, and in my opinion, no one really touches him. But that's just in terms of clinical psychology. But he is well read, he is wise, and he's very educated, right? And he's had a lot of life experiences. So he's probably processed an absurd amount of information and ideas and verbalized them into ways that can be communicated quite well, as we just saw. That, in my opinion, he is outstanding at this, and I have great respects for him for his ability to do that. Now, this is important in my opinion, because when we're talking about the difference between thoughts and imagination, or your conscious, whatever you want to, your subconscious, your intuition, your moral compass, whatever, right? If we view the imagination as your cognitive bias and your inner monologue as your ability to communicate, right? If we view those as two different things, because he's so well read, he doesn't need to imagine many ideas because he already understands them. And unlike his wife, who, you know, he thinks is very credible at this, maybe she's not as well read as him. You know, I've seen interviews and she seems like a lovely person. She also seems to be quite spiritual. I don't know if that's like Christian religion or just spiritualistic, right? And so maybe she lives more in the moment and doesn't have as many conceptual ideas processed as Jordan Peterson. And I think that's an important thing to note, because maybe that's why he doesn't realize this cognitive difference is happening, right? Because he's just too smart. Like, he knows everything and he doesn't know what else to imagine. I don't know if he spends time meditating, practicing mindfulness, learning the kinks of the imagination, because there are certain rules. And I think this is also what Carl Rogers talks about in the idea of congruence. So as he spoke here about the abstract and the real world is like the veil between what we think is real and what is actually real. And you can think anything is real, right? People have thought up every sort of idea. There's lots of like crazy ideas. People think, you know, they're old kins. You know, there are ideas that people truly believe that reincarnation exists as well on top of that. And there's just an absurd amount of ideas. I've met so many different people and seen so many absurd ideas. I just wondered how they get here. And basically, what I believe is the cognitive bias is going to fundamentally kick in and override all your ideas. So if you do believe in someone else's God, like a lot of other people do, and it seems like in this video, when the situation was happening, Jordan Peterson didn't really believe that much in shamanism or mysticism or some sort of magical being, right? Because he knows science and he knows psychology really well, and he seems to have come from it from a psychological approach. Now, I think it is important to note, if Dr. Jordan Peterson wasn't so well read and, you know, compassionate and understanding and wise, that he might not have been able to control this voice within his being. And if it was fundamentally toxic and it was in control of him, like it was overriding what he believes to be true, then that can cause a serious mental health issue down the road. And I think this is quite important, because sometimes this can actually be happening to people in the present moment and they don't realize it until a couple of years later and the symptoms are out of their control, right? And then you have like a diagnosed mental health condition. And I think it can just snowball in that effect if it doesn't get treated. So I think this video is fantastic. I've watched this so many times and been in awe of it. And I just would like to emphasize that. The next video then I would like to show is one where Jordan Peterson is talking. I'm not going to show much of it because there's only like a small little bit that is quite relevant. But it's Jordan Peterson talking about Carl Jung and the Red Books, which are, from what I understand, Carl Jung had the ability to differentiate his thoughts from his imagination. And I don't know if he knew this himself or if he just naturally did it without realizing. But obviously, your ability to imagine ideas is absolutely endless. It's infinite. The only limitation to our ability to create ideas is our inability to focus on them forever, right? Which is like sitting there meditating and you know, going into your own mind. Like, you have a limitation, which is your physical being, but the imagination is infinite. You can imagine absolutely anything. You can imagine, you know, flying through the air, winning the lottery, making a difference in the world, someone telling you, I guess, they love you, or getting a dream job. And on the other side of that, you can imagine the worst things possible happening to you. So obviously, like someone breaking your heart, someone just doing something bad to you, right? There's a lot of bad things that can unfortunately happen. And sometimes if we get stuck in the imagination of the bad things that happen to us, so if we think, once again, that the cognitive bias that we have is that life is suffering, you know, Schopenhauer's, you know, Earth is a prison and we're all here to suffer, right? If you believe that and life is meaningless and you deserve to suffer, then your cognitive bias or your imagination in your brain is always gonna it's always gonna pick the information that fits that cognitive bias, right? So it's like, it could be anything, right? You could be walking down the street and I know a car like runs through a puddle and soaks you, and your reaction to that is, if you're miserable, unhappy, and you think or your life is meant to suffer, you're gonna jump to conclusions, or your imagination's gonna jump to conclusions about like all these things happening to you for a bad reason. And if you can't tell the difference between this, then you might actually believe that is real, and then you just start to believe it, right? And over a long enough period of time, that starts to happen. Now, when it comes to the imagination, it is important to note that you can just make stuff up, right? So if I wanted to imagine someone talking to me, like a dead relative or Jordan Peterson or someone I met in the past who I'd like to talk with, I can theoretically imagine them within my being and have a conversation with them, right? Because if you pay close attention, when you think of something in the imaginative way, you view it. It's not like the imagination is your thought. You are choosing what to view. And it's the same thing within memories. At least for me anyways, I have a very, very, very good memory. Like the best memory I've ever had, I'm out of anyone I've ever met. And it's very vivid. I can go into memories, I can freeze them, I can float around in 3D, and it's all vivid, you know. And I can also remember or feel the emotions that go along with that memory. And same into the future. I can make up stuff, and I can do nearly anything within my imagination. And I don't know if this is a genetic trait, or if it's something it was nurtured into having, or if I just, I worked on it and it's a skill that you can develop and become self-aware of. So I'll play that quick video of Jordan Peterson talked about Carl Jung's Red Books now.
And so he wrote these books, notebooks that haven't been published yet, called the Black Books. And the Black Books are the documentation of his experiments with his imagination. And what he would do is daydream, like a child daydreams. He regained that faculty, although I think with Jung it was a faculty that had never really disappeared. And he had figures of imagination that came to him that he could speak with. And he spoke with these figures of imagination and documented that over a very long period of time. And that was eventually distilled into a book called The Red Book, which was published about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a book that Jung regarded as the central source from which all his inspiration emerged. It was sort of, the way it looks to me is that we embody a lot of information in our action, right? And our action has developed as a consequence of imitating other people. And not only the people around us, but of course the people around us imitated the people who came before them, and those people imitated the people who came before them, and so on, so far back that it's as far back as you can go. And so you embody these patterns of behavior that are extremely informative, that you don't understand, that are a consequence of collective imitation across the centuries. And so then those patterns can become manifest as figures of the imagination. And those figures of imagination are the distillations of patterns of behavior. And so as the distillations of patterns of behavior, they have content. And it's not you, that content. You could even think about it as content that's evolved, although it's culturally transmitted. It's content that's evolved. And so these figures of the imagination can reveal the structure of reality to you. And that's what happened with Jung, and that's what he described in the Red Book, and that was what permeated his psychology, a psychology that was based on the presupposition that the fundamental archetypal structures of religious belief were not pathological, not deceitful, not protective in some delusional sense against the fear of death, but quite the contrary. The very stories that enabled us to move forward as confident human beings in the face of chaos itself. And it's conceivable, I think perhaps probable, that nothing more important conceptually happened in the 20th century than that.
So yeah, that was a pretty wild video. And I think that emphasizes some really great ideas, as Jordan Peterson pointed out, because I think the ability to imagine figures, I'm guessing in Carl Jung's case, he imagined omnipotent beings, and each one maybe represented its own idea, and its own emotion, or its own view, or its own truth that it believed was true. And then maybe Carl Jung would get them to interact with each other as well, because you can actually imagine two people interacting with each other and just observe the conversation, right? You can imagine that. But you can also go one level above this, and if you were to envision the entire universe as a conscious entity and have that talk to you about ideas, then I personally think that's a little bit of a level above this, because it's everything, right? But that is a very hard thing to conceptualize, because you're conceptualizing everything into one idea. And yeah, that's taken quite a long time to conceptualize. And I think that's quite important, because I don't believe that anyone should follow anyone else's deity or omnipotent entity. I don't believe anyone should follow anyone else's God. I think the fundamental truth is people use the word God to explain what's impossible because they can't truly comprehend it. And in Jordan Peterson's case, he seems to focus a lot on Jesus Christ, which is only 2,000 years ago. Jesus Christ didn't make the universe. He says that God made the universe, and that religion. But that's only 2,000 years old, right? Like, there's billions of years, or 13 billion years before that, where there's no answer. And I think that is a more important paradoxical idea to put at the start of time than instead of like 2,000 years ago, because it's a paradox. It's technically an infinite paradox, because you're always going to end up who made God, and what was God doing before the Big Bang, if you think he existed. And at some point something came out of nothing, and as far as we understand in this universe and with the laws of physics, that's not really possible, right? Like, you can't have nothing and then have something that created everything. Like, it just doesn't make sense. It's completely paradoxical, in my opinion. And I think that idea is so incomprehensible for most people that they have to use words like God. And at some point, maybe someone just named it God, or like they came up with an idea and then it got stolen and whatever happened, right? And then people have continuously just recycled this idea, creating religions for a long time. So I think that's really important. And the next video is going to be a little bit more interesting. So this is basically incorporating the most noble ideas of a human being you can into your own being, and how you would assimilate those ideas together, right? So the next video is going to be, once again, is Jordan Peterson talking about Carl Jung and how he thinks Carl Jung was radical. And I do agree that I think like human beings are kind of like four-dimensional entities, because we can feel, we can think, and we can know, and then we can like feel time, right? Because time is like its own dimension, right? Because I have my past self and I have my future self, which is like really cool. But if I can imagine myself becoming the best version of myself, orienting my future self, like if I imagine the best possible outcome of myself coming back to me and talking to me in the present, then that's like a pretty wild idea, right? And if I can focus on that to become better, then that I think is a very, very strong idea for like self-actualization and individualization. And of course, you can use that then to self-improve. So that's basically the next video, and he talks a lot better than myself, but we'll jump into that now.
Like, because Jung was unbelievably radical. Like, here's one of his ideas. He thought that it was necessary. He believed that psychotherapy could be replaced by a supreme moral effort. And so the moral effort would be something like aiming at the good and then trying to integrate yourself around that. And that the good at which you aimed would be something approximating what you would be like if you manifested your full potential. And that you'd have a glimmering of what that full potential was. So that would be the potential future you. And he thought of that he thought of people as four-dimensional entities, essentially, that were stretched across time. And that you, as a totality across time, including your potential, manifested yourself also in the here and now. And that part of what your potential manifested itself was something like the voice of conscience or intuition. It's an amazing idea. It's an amazing idea, right? Because it's like what you could be in the future beckons to you in the present and helps you determine the difference between good and evil. It's a mind-boggling idea, and I think that it's an idea you have to contend with. And then he went further than that, and this is also a remarkable idea. He was interested in the symbolic representation of Christ, and I mean psychologically speaking, and he thought of Christ as the representation of the ideal potential human. It's something like that. So it was a symbolic, at minimum, that's what Christ was, is a symbolic representation of the ideal potential of a human being. And so for Jung, there was no psychological difference between who you could be in the future, beckoning to you in the present, and orienting yourself in relationship to Christ. Psychologically, those were the same thing. And then, so that's a pretty mind-boggling idea. Like, seriously, that's a mind-boggling idea. Especially when you add the psychological idea that one of the things that characterizes your ideal future self is the ability to make sacrifices, right? And the deeper the sacrifice, the better. And then also to recover from the sacrifice, right? So that's the death and rebirth. So the part of you that's most essential to your full flowering as a being is your ability to let things go and then spring back from that. So to die in some sense and to be reborn in the service of a higher good. And then the next part of that is that the direction of the world depends on you doing that.
So yeah, that's a great video. Hopefully, once again, he explains things a little bit better, and I've been here conceptualizing these ideas for a very long time by myself, and it's hard to word, especially without an external presence to communicate them correctly or have them give feedback. But I think what he's talking about here is absolutely critical. I think it's so important, right? It's hard to emphasize how important this is, because once again, the cognitive bias is going to come into effect, because if you don't believe in yourself and you believe that your life might be designed to suffer, right? I've had, not abusive parents, but my parents were alcoholics. I've seen them fight and have brutal and bloody fights. And, I've gone through some traumatic experiences in my life, right? And sometimes you might believe that all there is suffering and pain and misery and sadness, and that's life, right? And I don't believe that's the case. It's taken me a lot of mental training to overcome, I had drinking problems, to overcome my drinking problems, to realize like I was a pushover, I didn't stand up for myself, I didn't believe in myself. And then as I started standing up for myself once I started standing up for myself sober, then I realized I didn't have to get drunk to stand up for myself. Like, I didn't need alcohol to be courageous. I started to build that courage up within myself. And it's been a number of years focusing on this idea, but once again, it's what he's talking about here that basically helped me. So I believe, I believe everyone should believe in themselves. I believe that we shouldn't have the ability to hurt others unless they're oppressing others. And I believe that we should make the world a better place. And I stick to those, and I think those are very important things. And then if we were to emphasize what Carl Jung said, or what he said about Carl Jung here, about how he views Jesus Christ as like the most noble human being now is in existence, right? If we remove all magical powers, whatever, but as a human being, he seemed like, I've heard like a lot of people, he never really oppressed people. He might not have done the best thing all the time, but once again, sometimes you don't know, and intentions also matter. But he always tried to make a difference, and he tried to stand up for what he believed in. And I think those are very noble traits. Personally, I would say like who I know is actually real, and there's like more documentation on it. I think like Desmond Doss from the film Hacksaw Ridge is a very noble human being, like risking your own life, running into like battle scenes and war to save people. I think is like absolutely noble and really fantastic. So that guy is like one of my favorite people in history for being noble. And then this is important because, once again, if you can't tell the difference between what you believe is real, your imagination, and what you can think and you're in a monologue, then you're going to think that they're the same things. And you're not going to have complete control over them because you can't control your intuition. You condition it, right? So if you focus on negative things, you're going to train this to focus on negative things. And whenever something happens and you're like, oh, why did this thing happen to me? It's going to brew out from within your being. Like he said, your thoughts come out. And I do believe it revolves around cognitive bias and intuition and two entities within the brain. I don't know how exactly to communicate because I'm not a neuroscientist. I would say I'm a philosopher. But it seems like ideas have an overriding effect of our being than what we believe, or than what is seen to be true so far in science, right? Because the problem with science and psychology is you can't really scientifically prove what's the best idea, right? And you can't scientifically prove that God exists. You can't scientifically prove why we exist. And there's no premise. So at some point you need like your own opinions of reality and intuition and your experiences to build up what you think is real. And it is better the more consistent that is as a whole, and more consistent it is with reality and like the laws of physics. Because if you believe in something that's not real, then eventually it's going to brew to the surface, and the longer it takes to brew, the more it's going to cost you, right? Like if you're in pain and you have suffering and there's like a pill that you have to swallow, like a pill of denial, the longer you go on in time, the bigger the pill is going to get. And it gets harder to swallow to the point where you might not even be able to swallow it, and you're doomed for life at that point in time. And I don't want people to really suffer. It's not an enjoyable experience being like a prisoner of your own being, as I can truly tell you. And so I think that's important. I think that's very, very important. And just to add on to that, like my religious ideology would be something like pantheist. So I don't know where God came from. He might have created it himself. It's paradoxical. There's no answer. We'll probably never know the answer. But I do think that if there was God, he is intertwined with the universe itself. And I do think that consciousnness is intertwined with reality because of how subjective it is. I don't know entirely why I completely believe that, but I think it seems true, right? Because there's just too much weird things that happen in life. He refers to them as synchronicities, thanks to Carl Jung, and he uses that word in the next video, and I think it's a very true thing. But what is also more important is, once again, if you don't know what to believe, or if you believe in other people's ideas, once you start to have pain or suffering, your psyche splits, and your brain or your consciousness or your subconscious or your unconscious, the internal witness, the critic, even God in some people's eyes, your brain will replicate what you think is the fundamental meaning to life and duplicate that or pretend to be it. So if you believe in God, your conscious being is going to pretend to be God, right? And there's nothing you can do to escape that apart from sitting there and going through what you believe is real, and if you were told to believe it or if you have experienced it yourself, right? And I think that's the fundamental difference there. So the next video we're gonna get on to, which is mainly the main reason for making this video. The next video is Jordan Peterson having a little bit of a sad moment, or basically crying. I don't know if he's kind of, I think it's more sadness or uncomfortability or unknownness, right? Because it must be quite hard for Jordan Peterson to look up to other people for Nobelism, right? Because he's at the top. Like, this is something I experienced myself because I've looked at a lot of psychology and opinions and philosophy and lots of things to try and figure out what happened to me, because I, once again, may have accidentally induced this. When he's talking about the voices and he's like, oh, this, I've had that for 5 years now. It's been since September 2016, and it's still here. It's always going, and I don't know why. So this is like the main point of why I'm doing this, but also I think this is a very important topic because I've spoken to a lot of individuals and they've always been like, whoa, but no one's been able to match these ideas. So I'm a little bit lonely in the sense that I don't know if I'm right or wrong. But this is what we're going to jump into next with the next video of Jordan Peterson.
Story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief, and I don't understand it. Like, because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. You know, that's Jungian synchronicity. Yeah. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. You know, we have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet, let's
both,
say.
I think you, because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
All right, so that's a little bit of a sadder video. One of these reasons I'm making this is to talk about these ideas, because he sounds troubled. That's a good few months ago, and I've been worried about making this video because I feel like it could be very, very controversial, and I don't entirely want that, but at the same time, I need to get these ideas out there now so I can see if I'm right or wrong and improve on my own being at this time, because I spent a few years just basically by myself coming up with these ideas. And there's a lot going on there in that video, because he calls it the narrative and the objective, right? So that's like the real world and the abstract. That's what he's referring to there. And they touch all the time. I call this, once again, the veil between to me, it's the veil between what we're allowed to think and what we're allowed to imagine. Because if you can imagine something that's not true, and then you interact with the real world and you get proven it's not true, you get like pushed down or backed down or beaten down, or if you're around like really toxic and bad people. Because if you want to talk about like doing illegal things or making the world a better place, worse a place, then only other people who are negative will be inspired by those ideas. And that's quite critical, because you don't want to get sucked into negativity. And then the way he talks about having a narration. So I don't know if he thinks he might be Jesus Christ because that's what he thinks Jesus Christ was like, because Jesus Christ had voices of God, because that's what it says in the Bible as far as I understand. Or he has enough experiences where he just compares himself to Jesus Christ, or like, because he gets put on a pedestal by so many people, because once again he is Jordan Peterson, that maybe he views himself as like a Christ-like figure, or of some sort. So this is one thing I would really like to ask him. But what he's talked about in regards to synchronicity is absolutely correct, and this is really interesting, right? Because you can, if you were to sit there and imagine what happens in the future, if this happens, if that happens, and then it actually does happen, you're like, whoa, how did that happen? And I've experienced this a lot of times in like really insane ways. I would actually like to ask him what experiences he had, because there's this element of, if you're trying to live in the future, or you're trying to work on your best possible self, then you are thinking about the future. And then if you achieve that, and what you believe would happen happens, it's a very, very existential type of feeling. At first, anyways, because I would say it's existential. And then once you get through the existentialism, that's where the enlightenment is, right? Because once you start to create these ideas and create your own idea of your perfect self and then try to live up to that because that's your most noble person in the future, and then it actually happens, it is a very overwhelming moment. And I've had a lot of moments like this in my life, so I really appreciate where he's coming from. Obviously, it gets a little bit complicated because people call this God. However, once again, if your imagination, or you believe that God really exists and your imagination is trying to duplicate God and communicate to you, and then it says something in the future is going to happen, and then it happens, you kind of lose your mind. It would it's happened to me a few times, and there's near enough video evidence of it, because I am a championship winning esports manager. I'm a professional video gamer, and it's happened a few times with regards to that and some other instances. But yeah, that's very mind-blowing to me. And then just to emphasize this a little bit more, so there is a book, I spoke with the author on Reddit. It's called the Essential Schizophrenia Companion, and it's written by someone called Robert Francis, which is a pseudonym. So very nice person. I spoke to him on Reddit briefly. I bought this book and I read it so I could talk to him and understand it. And one thing, he never actually responded, right? So hopefully I didn't give him an existential crisis. But within the book, he's talking about how he has auditory hallucinations, right? And I kind of know what that feels like. Because you hear something, you're like, well, where did it come from? But as we just saw in that video of Jordan Peterson talking about how he had voices, the critic, it's basically like that, because you're like, well, where does it come from? Now, the interesting thing is, once again, cognitive bias and ideas seem to override certain elements of a human being. Because within this book, he talks, the gentleman talks a lot about how Christ and religion and God saved him, as he is a Christian, from his misery. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. But if you really, I asked him, how much do you believe in the Bible and God? Because within the Bible, there is, stories of audible hallucinations, because I'm pretty sure Moses has a talk, there's a talking bush, right? That's an auditory hallucination, right? Because unless someone can get me proof of a talking bush, that doesn't happen. But if you believe that that's how God can communicate with you in an omnipotent voice, like in the Bible, like what happened to Jesus Christ, can your imagination or your conscious being or your intuition replicate that and talk to you? Right? Because if it's like, hey, you did this thing that's really wrong, and you're like, oh, it's an auditory hallucination, this isn't real, you throw away what it's saying. You don't listen to what it's saying, you just throw it. You're like, that's not real, bullshit. And you throw it. It doesn't matter what it's saying. It questions, where did it come from, right? And obviously those, where did it come from is still quite important, but I would once again say, from my own personal experience, because as I changed what I believed to be true, the voice inside my head has also changed its voices, right? So now it's just me. It's like my own being is like I said, I think the best premise I can put is my future self is trying to talk to me from the past, from the future, and guide me. And obviously that's all self-conceived of what I think is a noble human being, how to become better, all the knowledge I've learned, the experiences I've had, and unfortunately the traumatic traumas I've had in my life as well. And to conceptualize all these ideas, put them into words like this, and then try and become better, which I have done, is taken quite a long time. But these are a lot of ideas. I'm not trained. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have any further education. I actually failed English in school, so I have a hard time reading as I am dyslexic. And all of these different things. So how I arrived at these conclusions is basically from my own traumatic and unsettling experiences. And yeah, basically to summarize this video is, that's what I think schizophrenia is, basically, right? And I think too many people are afraid to be self-aware of the fact that they're not completely in control, but they condition their thoughts and their beliefs based on their actions and what they focus on. And I think a lot of people are in denial from life and what they believe to be true, and they're they're suffering as a result of this, especially like people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. There are a couple of videos where I've spoken to some people, but I spoke to a colleague of Dr. Eleanor Longdon, who has done a TED talk about schizophrenia. She's a doctor who researches it, and I spoke to someone who researches psychosis, because I definitely used to have that, but thankfully I'm good now and I can actually like skateboard and stuff now. Because back in the day, I couldn't walk in the dark without falling over. Like if I went to the toilet and I didn't turn the landing light on or the hallway light on, I would just fall over in the dark. And that was a very weird experience. And once again, it's been about 5 years since the original incident that led me to these realizations. And I'm at the point now where I basically need to talk to people, and I would really like to talk with Jordan Peterson about these ideas. So hopefully, if anyone knows Jordan Peterson, I'm going to send it off to him if I can. Can link this. If people are interested, I might make more videos, because I did maybe want to do a react video to Eleanor Longdon. And there's also the Lad Bible 9 Minutes with a Schizophrenic dude, who seemed like a really genuine guy. And he basically had schizophrenia, that the devil was haunting him because he was brought up in a strict religious family and he's gay. So he thought he was a sinner because he believed that God was real and the devil was real, and he was a sinner, and he got like institutionalized because it was haunting him. And it's just like, I truly believe it's just your imagination, your conscious, just communicating with you. And if you're too afraid to acknowledge what it's saying, you lose your fucking mind. And a thought experiment that might help people understand this a little bit better, which is a little bit scary. So don't try this if you get easily spooked. But so if you were to imagine yourself, so you have your thoughts, and then you go into your imagination and you envision yourself talking to yourself, right? You can kind of do that. There's a spectrum of how much a person should loves themselves versus how much they hate themselves, right? So if we think there's the center, right, here's hate and there's love, right? So, it's hard to do it with 2 hands, 3 lines, but there's that. In the center is the balance, right? So everything you is hate, everything there's love. Now, if you think you hate yourself, imagine or envision yourself saying, I love myself. I deserve to be happy. I can be better. Like, the future is mine for the taking. Stuff like this that are positive, that once again, like, will lead you to believe in yourself. But if you say them out loud or you envision them and you monitor those things, pay attention to what you feel. Because if you say, oh, I love myself, and you hate yourself, deep down, your brain is going to just give you like a shiver or something. Because your brain is like, you're fucking lying. You're lying. And you'd be like, oh. And that's a good internal way. Like, that's how you find the internal being of yourself, right? Because if you're like, oh, I actually do, like, if you say I love myself and you have a negative reaction, that means you kind of hate yourself and don't believe that you deserve love or happiness or meaning in your life. And then you have to ask yourself, why do you think that is? Like, why do you believe that you don't deserve it? And then on the other side of the spectrum, if you're narcissistic or you're like egotistical and love yourself too much, obviously you should love yourself, you should praise yourself, you should have self-worth, but you shouldn't be a dick about it, basically, or put other people down and just be a nasty person as a whole. But if you imagine then saying, like, I don't like myself, you're a bad person, you deserve to suffer, I hate you, or something, envision yourself saying that to yourself, and then judge your reaction on that, right? Because I remember I'd done this to a very popular streamer, because I'm a Twitch streamer, and I said, oh, what happens if you envision saying something nasty to yourself? And he's like, whoa. He's like, I just said something racist to myself. He's like, I hate that guy. That was like a really like, oh. And I think that really like emphasized it. And once again, you go from there, right? Because sometimes, like, you can be too cocky. You can be too into yourself. And you want that balance. And then as a whole, that, in my opinion, is where ideas of, the real world meet the imaginary world, the abstract, the narration, the belief system. That's where they combine. And I think that's what Jordan Peterson is talking about with the synchronicity of this. And that's why he's going on and having issues. And no one else talks about this. No one else talks about this. So it's taken me a long time to basically just word this. And I would really love to talk about these ideas with many people. And if there's any questions, anyone wants to basically talk to me or ask my opinion of things or how I break down other ideas, because I have many ideas in terms of how we process our emotions and our feelings, or the ideas that we believe are true and how we conceptualize them. I basically only focus on this and how to get self-worth. So yeah, I'm gonna try and make more content on this, but my main goal for now is to try and talk to more professionals who at least understand this idea and this concept. So until next time, guys, until next video, thank you all for watching. I hope this isn't too long, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.